I think this is the third time I have been at the Silicon Valley Humanist over several years, and twice, including today, I've talked to you about fundamentals of humanism. And I have to say, I'm always a little bit intimidated, feel like I'm bringing coals to Newcastle when I come to a humanist group that's been around for decades, and many of you sitting out in the audience, I'm sure, knows a lot more about humanism than I do. But I was very happy to get the opportunity to come here and talk to you. I think it is important that we, from time to time, talk about humanism. You know, we talk about a lot of stuff at our various groups. We're interested in science, we're interested in politics, social justice, the environment. All that, those are topics that humanists are concerned about. But we forget to talk about the basics of humanism a lot. And it's good for us to remind ourselves what it's all about, but also new people come in who may not have a good idea of what humanism is and wonder why we're talking about all these different things. And also, I'm always amazed about the number of people that I run across who either have a very vague idea of what humanism is, or other people who, when I tell them what humanism is, say, yeah, I've been a humanist all my life, I just didn't know what to call it. So that's one reason we need, I think, to have these kinds of events from time to time. So thank you again for the opportunity to come here. And this will be a talk focusing on humanism. We will be looking at the basic principles, going through the history, and looking at the relevance of it for us here in the 21st century. So quite a bit to cover. I did go to the Humanist Institute, if you're familiar with that. That was at the time I went anyway, was a low residency program, about a 3-year program, where you could study humanism in depth. It's now been taken into the American Humanist Association Department of Education. So they still have courses, and if you're interested in learning more about humanism, I would suggest you look those up. So anyway, let's get started. See, I don't have a clock here, so So what is humanism? I think if we're going to talk about the history and the relevance, we really have to know what it is. So how are we going to answer that question? Well, you know, we don't have a pope, right? There's no humanist pope, so there's no one there to tell us what is humanism. We don't have a council or anything like that, like many religious groups do. So we've got to use other methods. I can tell you what I think about humanism, but I want to tell you what I think it is, plus tell you why I think it is. So I'm going to use a variety of different approaches. First, I'm just going to look at definitions from a wide variety of sources and see what's common to all those definitions. And what's common probably is going to be one of the fundamental principles of humanism. Then I'm going to go back into history, and we're going to look at where do these words come from? When did humanist and humanism, when did they start being used, and how were they used at the time? And then we're going to do a romp through history and look and see where these ideals that we have identified as being basic to humanism, how did they develop over the centuries. So here's several definitions. So you don't have to read all of this, but I just want to point out that these are from a wide variety of sources. We have definitions from textbooks, dictionaries, a couple of different humanist organizations. And there are a couple of ideals or principles, I think, that repeat in every one of these. So one of these I have highlighted in red and the other in blue. And so we can look at those, compile those and look at those in a little bit more detail. One is an appeal to reason in contrast to revelation or religious authority, rejection of supernaturalism, rejection of supernatural religion, does not accept supernatural views of reality, and without supernaturalism. So I think supernaturalism is out. I think that's one thing we can be very confident of in these definitions. So what does that mean? How do we name that? Well, I would name it naturalism, the philosophy of naturalism. And naturalism is the philosophical conclusion that the only reality is nature, as gradually discovered by our intelligence using the tools of experience, reason, and science. Now the things I highlighted in blue are here. The capacity for self-realization through reason, right and responsibility to give meaning to our own lives, grounding for morality and the welfare of human rather than fulfillment of the will of God, advancement of humanity by its own efforts, the building of a more humane society, and the ability to lead meaningful, ethical lives and adding to the greater good of humanity. Now, what do we call this? This is a little harder to name with a single word, but I'm going to use the word flourishing, which in history you can go back and that word is often used. And flourishing means to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way, especially as a result of a particular favorable environment. So I think when we talk about flourishing, we have to look at flourishing on several levels. There's certainly flourishing of the individual. All of us want to be happy. All of us want to accomplish whatever we can. And we have to look at society. We want society to flourish also, because the individual cannot flourish in a bad society. And then nature. We want nature to flourish, because society nor the individual can flourish in a environment which is degraded. So all of these things have to be our concern, and I think are the concerns of humanism. Now, this is, you may have seen this before, since I've spoken here before and shown it to you, to those of you who were here. This is my little way of very succinctly representing humanism. Say this is twin pillars: naturalism and flourishing. And hopefully that's a good way that people can remember what is the basic, at least according to my ideas, the basic principles of humanism. All right, now let's look at the origin of the words. The word humanist actually goes back a long, long way. It was probably used by some of the ancient Greek and Roman writers, but it really became more common during the Renaissance. And these were people, usually Christian, because everyone was Christian back then. Otherwise they would burn you at the stake, but that goes without saying. But these were people who, during the Renaissance, they rediscovered the writings and other things of the classical people in the ancient Roman and Greek world, and they thought they were pretty good. That is Cicero and Seneca and these people, they really liked these writings. So these people were called humanists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The word humanism, when you put an ism on it, that's kind of a system of thought, right? And that came up much more recently, and it's kind of vague where it did come from. One of the first people to use it and to say what he meant by it was Friedrich Niethammer. He was a educator in Germany, and there was a big conflict about how to do education. Some people wanted to only be the practical, the math, the science, and that sort of thing. Other people thought it should include the humanities, and for those who, including Niethammer, who wanted to include the humanities, this theory of education was called humanism. And then there was a book by Arnold Rouge in 1852, who wrote about humanism as a social ethics and values not dependent upon supernaturalism. So that's pretty much of a modern understanding of the word. Jacob Burckhardt linked humanism and the Renaissance, as we just did. Simmons gave a definition very similar to the modern usage of humanism. So the word was starting to be used in the 19th century, but it wasn't well known, I think. With the publication of the Humanist Manifesto 1 in 1933, at that point I think it became much more understood, and the manifesto laid out the ideas that humanism represented, at least to those people who wrote the Humanist Manifesto 1. But I think it's a foundational document for contemporary humanism. All right, so let's look back in history and see where those two pillars came from, the naturalism and a concern for flourishing. We have to go all the way back, of course, to the ancient Greeks, 600 BCE. And we know by going through history that these philosophers started wondering, well, what's the earth made of and how does it work? And for the very first time, they didn't rely on religion. They didn't rely on myths or legends. But they started trying to figure it out using their rational mind and experimentation to some extent. One of the first people, some people call him the father of philosophy, is Thales in Greece. And he decided that the universe was made of water. I'm not sure why he decided that, but he got that a little bit wrong. However, we have to give him credit because he was someone who was trying to figure out, understand the universe not based upon supernaturalism. So that's important. It's one of the first times that in recorded history that we know about that. And closer, a lot of other Greeks followed him. Others people decided that the universe was made of, fire, earth, water, or whatever. Some, Leucippus and Democritus, decided it was made of atoms. That sounds pretty modern. And so we have a whole range of different ideas of how the universe works. Now, on the flourishing side, some philosophers were also concerned about how do people live their life, not only about what the universe is made of and how it works, but what about human beings? How should they live, and how should they build their societies? And of course, Aristotle is one of the most well-known person. He said humans are part of nature, and that's very much familiar to us because we believe in evolution and we evolved just like all the other animals, and so very much an integral part of nature. He believed that reason sets humans apart from other animals. I'm not sure that's true. I think our reason is probably more developed than most animals, but I'm not sure they don't have reason. He believed that happiness is the highest good. And you'll see this repeated in a lot of different philosophers that I'm going to talk about. And what do they mean by happiness? Well, there's one idea of a hedonistic, live it up, have the high life, and that sort of thing. But in most cases, in all these cases, this is not what they were talking about. They thought that the contemplation of philosophy and thinking about stuff and understanding stuff was the best way to become happy. Aristotle also believed to live the good life, you should have concern for other people. So I think we can see humanism way here very early in this period being developed. So then we move, the Romans, of course, conquered everybody, and including the Greeks, but several philosophies emerged, and they were based, I think, to a large degree on the philosophers of ancient Greece. But the two of the most well-known are Stoicism and Epicureanism. And the Stoics believe that nature and God are identical. So that's sort of naturalism. If you want to study God, you got to study nature, and there's no supernaturalism outside of nature. So I think we could say that naturalism is part of Stoicism. Flourishing, this is very commonly known, of course, distinguish what lies in our powers and what does not, master the former and accept the latter. That's good advice. Also, using one's mind to understand the world and by working together and treating others fairly and justly. So, the flourishing aspect of that. Epicurus got a lot of bad press because, we think of an Epicurean even these days as someone who just likes to eat a lot, fine food, fine wine, and that sort of thing. And Epicurus did say that we should pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and that can be misconstrued very easily. But in reality, he believed that mental pleasures contribute to happiness much more than physical pleasure, so very much like Aristotle. And he was certainly a materialist, so naturalism is certainly part of his philosophy, and in fact, he was an atomist, so he believed that the world is made of atoms. All right, so then what happened? We go into the Dark Ages, and humanism, even in its proto-forms, kind of disappears. And why is that? Well, Rome fell, and no one could really bring about the political unity which had been part of Rome for so long. This is a picture of Constantine. This is actually, this thing in the foreground is his sarcophagus in Rome. And the legend has it that he was involved in one of the many civil wars that Rome was involved in at that period of time. And he supposedly saw a cross in the sky and a voice telling him that he should fight under the banner of the cross and that he would win the Civil War. Well, apparently he did, and he did win the Civil War. So he decided, if the legend is true, that Christianity wasn't such a bad thing after all, and up until that point, of course, Rome had been persecuting Christians who would not worship the emperor as a god. And about that time, about 10%, as I understand it, of Rome were Christian, so they were a fairly significant part of the population, and they were increasing in number, so probably Constantine thought they were a pretty good group to be on his side to help him bring the Roman Empire back under his control. And but there's a real problem. the Christians didn't agree on a lot of stuff. Very basically, they didn't agree that who Jesus was. That's kind of fundamental. Some thought he was a god, and some people thought he was a man, and all things in between. So Constantine didn't like that, so he called a council at Nicaea in 325 AD and told the church leaders that they needed to iron this out and come up with a single doctrine which would be true for all Christians. And the doctrine which won out is that indeed Jesus is God, and so the idea of the Trinity. Humans are sinful, and that the God or Jesus died on the cross so that these sinful people would not necessarily have to be consigned to hell if they behave themselves. So Christianity grew in power, and it was aligned with the state of Rome and thereafter. And I have this slide because I think it depicts a situation we see over and over and over in history. If we go back to the ancient Egyptians, the first painting here shows the Pharaoh, and there's a god on either side ministering somehow to the Pharaoh. So people learned in early civilization that if you got the gods on your side, or at least you got the people who said that they knew who the gods were on your side, then that could consolidate your power. I mean, you're not going to rebel against somebody who's, maybe a god himself, or at least a god is supporting. So we find this occurring over and over in history, and certainly we know the divine right of the king was part of European history for a very long time. And so the second picture depicts the bishops who are crowning a king. And then in our lower picture, we see a more modern version of that, in my opinion. Well, we do live in a secular state, and we don't have an official religion, but many people in our country are religious, and some of them are, religious in a way that humanists can relate to and have common cause with. However, there are other people who are supporting policies which are very anti-humanist. They're very much against humanist principles, and in this lower picture we see Trump being prayed over, probably by evangelicals or fundamentalist brand of Christians. So religion is still a very important, a potent part of our political process. All right, getting back to the Dark Ages, with the church becoming hegemonic, it didn't want anyone to compete with it, so it closed all the schools in Athens by about 500 BC. It became the official state religion about that time. The Hellenistic philosophies were suppressed, as well as all the pagan religions. Heretics started being put to death, and free thought essentially comes to the end in Europe. The picture here is a statue of Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600. He had some weird ideas that the church didn't like. I mean, he didn't believe in the Trinity, but he also believed that stars were actually suns. Imagine that, and they had planets going around them, and that there were inhabitants in those planets. So that was a bit much for the church to take, so they burned him at the stake. So this statue was erected by Freemasons, actually, in 1889. All right, let's keep going. So we were in the Dark Ages for, almost 1,000 years. And but then the Renaissance comes about. And again, the Christian humanists, as I mentioned before, were people who were Christians because, like I say, everyone was Christian back then. But they liked the writings of the ancients, the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman. And for whatever reason, these documents started surfacing for the first time in a very long time. There were people going through ancient, very old churches and monasteries and finding these old documents. And plus, some were coming from the Arab world, and we know the Arabs were actually a better keeper of the ancient Greek and Romans than the Christian West was. Now, Erasmus, he wanted to reform Catholicism. He thought it was corrupt. He thought the doctrines were not biblical, but he did admire these Cicero and many of the other ancient writings. And so this is a quotation from him, which I think shows that very clearly. He says, "I cannot help but think that they were divinely inspired," referring to the ancients, "and perhaps the Spirit of Christ diffused itself further than we imagine, that there are more saints we should enroll in our calendar." So he thought somehow, even though they were pagan, pre-Christian, that they must have somehow been inspired by Christ. Kind of a difficult thing to understand, but so anyway, we know we have the Reformation about this time, and Luther and Calvin are leaders in this, and they want to reform a lot of the church, the corruption and some of the doctrines, but the essential fundamental doctrine that humans are evil, God came to earth in the form of Jesus, died so that people could maybe get to heaven. That dogma was not really challenged by the Reformation leaders. However, there is a part of the Reformation which actually we don't hear too much about because it's a relatively small movement, but it's called the Radical Reformation, and there were many groups within this group, but one was the Socinians, which I find very interesting. Their leader was Faustus Socinus, and they felt you had to use reason. So if you wanted to interpret the Bible, you couldn't just do it based on faith or based on tradition or what have you, but you had to use your mind. You had to use reason. And so they looked at the Bible and said, well, the Trinity doesn't seem very reasonable to me. Original sin doesn't seem very good. They reject the idea that Jesus died for human sinfulness. They advocated tolerance of different beliefs, freedom of conscience, and separation of church and state. Now, Socinus lived in one of those northern Italian, small, like Venice or I think Genoa actually, that grew up. And they had a relative amount of independence and freedom so they could think about these things. However, the Inquisition sort of caught on and said that we can't let this go on. So they started breathing down the neck of these people. And actually, Socinus and many of his followers fled to Poland, and of all places. And in Poland, there was, for some time anyway, there was protection, and they set up a printing press. And they started printing all these ideas and sending the books all over Europe. Now, if you were caught reading one of these books, you'd be punished, if not put to death. And these are the ideas, I think, of the Enlightenment, and this is pre-Enlightenment. So I'm not a historian. I doubt if many historians will support me on this, but I like to think that this was sort of the seeds of the Enlightenment, that some of the Enlightenment philosophers were reading these books, and it might have helped them along in their thinking, perhaps. The Catholic Church wanted to restore its lost Protestant lands, so the 30 Years' War went on, and it was a very awful time in Europe. Many deaths and famine and so forth. But then eventually the Enlightenment did come about. The Age of Reason is sometimes called. And we know there are several philosophers and scientists that are associated with the Enlightenment. And sometimes when I use the word enlightenment, people think, well, the world didn't become enlightened at that time because there was still a colonialization, there was still slavery, there was still a lot of awful things going on. And that's true. I'm just saying that the Enlightenment is when some people started thinking about these things. It took a long time for any of them to get actually implemented. But these are the seeds, I think, to the ideas of what we would call liberal democracy, I think, today. So scientific understanding of nature, democracy. De Holbach was even talking about atheism, and I always thought he must have been a very brave person. But I recently read he was using a pseudonym when he was doing this, so he wasn't stupid. Voltaire, of course, was critical of the church, wanted separation of church and state. And so these Enlightenment ideas the first time the effort was made to implement them was actually our own revolution and the establishment of our Constitution. So a lot of the ideas, as you see, I have listed there. Now this was very imperfect. I think we'll all agree to that. There was slavery in our country. The women could not participate in a democratic process. Native people's land was being taken and they were being killed. So, but it was a beginning, and hopefully we've made some progress since then. All right, so this brings us down to the modern age, and I could use Darwin because, in my view, I'm a trained biologist, but Darwin really changed the world, I think, with his theory of evolution, because now science had a way of explaining where people came from, where humans came from, where all the other species came from, and it kind of spilled over, I think, in other areas of science, how evolutionary theory can explain a lot of stuff. So there were several responses to that. The Christian religion, two major responses. One, fundamentalism. They simply rejected it all. The Enlightenment, Darwin, and they retained the old idea of the Abrahamic God as being this guy, long beard, floating around in the heavens, is going to throw you in hell if you got a chance. But there were other churches, and they call those modernist churches, and they attempted to reconcile theism with the Enlightenment and with Darwin. And usually they came up with some abstract view of God and a non-literal interpretation of the Bible. But then the third group would be humanism, who fully embraced the Enlightenment as well as Darwinism, and they boldly claimed the time for theism has passed. And they said that in Humanist Manifesto 1, which again was a document published in 1933. And there's a couple of quotes from the document. Humanism asserts that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantee of human values. In place of the old attitudes involved in worship and prayer, the humanist finds his religious emotions expressed in a heightened sense of personal life and in a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. So again, the flourishing of the individual as well as flourishing of society is there. And they use the word religious emotion because I think the writers of the first Humanist Manifesto saw that humanism was going to replace religion. And so they used that word, which looking back on it maybe was not the best word to use, but nevertheless that's what they did. All right, so that's my idea of what humanism is. And so now we will go on and talk about is humanism relevant today? We talked about Humanist Manifesto 1. It was written when the country was in a depression. It wasn't clear that capitalism would survive. There were fascism was on the march in Europe, and war clouds were on the horizon. So they tried to respond to those. So what is humanism saying today about the problems that we have? Well, first of all, humanism has not stayed static. There's been at least a couple of updates to the manifesto. We're now in Manifesto 3, which was published in 2003. And this was a product of the American Humanist Association. The committee put it together, and a lot of people signed it. And I'll be showing you some quotes from that. When you see red, this is quotations from the Humanist Manifesto 3. And here are some of the problems that I see that we're facing today. I mean, they're probably a lot longer. You could add a lot more to them, but I don't want to talk all day here. So secularization may seem strange as I would put that up there, but I'll explain it. Inequality. We have a tremendous problem with income inequality, and as a consequence, it's really a threat to democracies all around the world, including, I think, our own. And, of course, global warming, which is a very existential problem facing us. So let's look at those. So what do we mean by secularization? Well, that means that religion becomes less important, that people are no longer using religion to determine how to govern themselves, how to pass laws, and so forth. And this is a map which shows belief in God around the world. And the darker the color, the higher the belief in God. If the really dark colors, you're up to 80-90%. And our country is very dark blue in most parts. But if you look at Europe, many of the countries are not. They're very light. And so there, in many countries, Scandinavian countries, France, so forth, less than 50% of people believe in God. So secularization is definitely occurring in Europe. Now, why are we so different? And there were a lot of theories about that, and I won't be able to explain it, I'm sure. But we're moving in that direction too. If you look at people who are unaffiliated to any religion, which is, I think is an indication of secularization. We're up to 25% in our own country, and it seems to be going up. You never know what the future holds, whether it'll continue to go up or not, but we're headed in that direction. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the problem is, I think religion does do some things for people, for some people. And here are some of the things that I think religion does for people. Finding meaning in life. I mean, if you're a part of a church or whatever, then your meaning in life may be doing what you think God wants you to do, or trying to convert other people to your religion, or maybe doing good works in the name of your religion. Humanist Manifesto 3 says, humans are social by nature and find meaning in relationships. Well, I think we can all agree to that. We are social beings. We evolved that way. And I'm sure many of you come to these Silicon Valley humanist groups for the interesting talks, but probably you also come for community, because you come here with your friends, you meet your friends over and over again. And so humanist groups can provide this aspect that religion has provided for people in the past. The Humanist Manifesto 3 says, life's fulfillment emerges from individual participation in service of humane ideas. Well, the people are dedicated toward making the earth better, making the world better, through making the environment better, social justice. That gives you meaning, and I think many people do this, and this helps them find meaning in life. So I think the manifesto is right on there. Okay, how about a coherent understanding of the universe? Well, religion sort of does that for people. You know, God did it all, so that's pretty unified and coherent. I don't know how coherent it is, but the manifesto says humans are an integral part of nature, the result of unguided evolutionary change. So I think evolution gives us a sense of coherence. You know, we know where we came from, we know where a lot of other things came from, and we can understand human behavior today in light of evolution. And so I believe that the evolution and science in other aspects gives us a sense of understanding of the universe, which is coherent. Morality, many people believe morality and religion are inextricably bound together. However, the Manifesto 3 says ethical values are derived from human need and interests as tested by experience. We are committed to treating each person as having inherent worth and dignity. Okay, so is that true? Well, are there any countries that are not very religious in which it's true? Well, we don't have to go very far, I think. If you go to, I've got Denmark here, but you can go to a lot of the countries which have a low level of religion, and you can see low crime, strong social safety net, low levels of corruption, economic equality, high levels of trust in government, and low levels of belief in God. So clearly, you can have good societies without religion. So religion and morality are not inextricably linked. All right, let's go on to inequality. I think it's one of the biggest problems that we are facing in the world, the income inequality. This graph shows three countries, at least on the left side, the USA, the United Kingdom, and France. And it shows the percent of the national income that goes to the top 1%. So it's a measure of inequality. That used to be very high back in the early 19th century or 20th century, up to 50% and well over in some countries. And it's been going down up until 1980. In our own country, in 1980, it starts going in the other direction. And, there's a lot of reasons for that, I guess, but the fact is it is going in the other direction. Even more so in England and France, not so much, but certainly in our own country. And that, I think, is a real serious problem that will prevent people from flourishing, so it's something that we as humanists have to be concerned about. So Manifesto 3 says, we seek to minimize the inequities of circumstance and ability, and we support a just distribution of nature's resources and the fruits of human efforts so that as many as possible can enjoy a good life. And I think, again, with the inequality, one reason that populism, right-wing populism, is emerging all over the world, and this is definitely, I think, a threat to democracy, and the inequality, I think, is really a big part of that. Manifesto 3 says that humans are concerned for the well-being of all, are committed to diversity and respect those of differing yet humane views. We work to uphold the equal enjoyment of human rights and civil liberties in an open, secular society and maintaining the civic duty to participate in the democratic process. Okay, let's go to the last challenge we have, global warming. I found this slide on the internet, which really, to me, dramatically shows what we're facing. The yellow line is the level of CO2 in the atmosphere over 400,000 years. And you can see it oscillates back and forth. And as it goes up, the Earth gets warmer. As it goes down, the Earth gets colder. You know, look where we are now, the current level. We're far above anything we've ever seen for the last 400,000 years. And, you know, there are consequences to that. We're seeing that consequence already. This is the temperature, and I don't presume to be able to explain this entire slide, but this shows you the temperature of the Earth over the last 800 to a million years. And you can see that if we look at the last 10,000 years, our temperature has been pretty stable. And we invented agriculture 10,000 years ago. And the sum total of human civilization has taken place in this period where you've had relatively stable climates. Things are changing, though, and they're changing pretty quickly and pretty dramatically, as you know. This is the temperature increased since 1880, so definitely it's going up. It's going up pretty exponentially, and you see the over here at 2050 and 2100, the predictions, if we don't take dramatic action, this is what the temperatures are going to be. And clearly there'll be major impact on humans, the animal life, and the environment in general. Okay, so global warming isn't mentioned in Humanist Manifesto 3. At 2003, it really wasn't on the radar as much as it is now, I think. But it does talk about science. Knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Humanists find that science is the best method for determining this knowledge as well as for solving problems and developing beneficial technologies. So, you know, the scientists tell us that what's happening, and there are a lot of people who are in denial. They will not believe that humans are contributing to global warming, even though scientists tell us almost universally. And then humanists maintain it is a planetary duty to protect nature's integrity, diversity, and beauty in a secure, sustainable manner. All right, so this is the last slide, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about organizations, because I think it's great you have this group here. You've been here, what, 50 years or so, a long time, and I think it's very important that we have more groups like this, and we're trying to build one up in San Francisco, because I think if we want the world to become more in tune with humanist values, we have to build stronger, better organizations. There's a lot of people out there who are humanists, but maybe they don't belong to an organization, and you know, some people just don't like belonging to organizations. But I do believe that we can make a bigger impact faster if we support our organizations and strengthen them, and so I hope we all do that in the future. So that's my talk, and I'm happy now, I guess, to entertain questions. And Carl, I think, has a microphone, so please let him give you the microphone.
Yeah, remember, as I say every Sunday, hold the microphone like this. See, like this. Not like this. Like this, okay? Not down here. Not here. Doesn't work very well this way. Directly in. Okay? So I'm going to, people raise your hands, and I will go around in the order I can sort of figure out who raised their hand first. So, okay, here, microphone.
Thank you. You did not mention at least two, I think, other challenges to humanism that maybe not only to humanism. So let me just say. One of them is that besides this inequality and threat to democracy, we have a growing threat, and besides climate change, we have a growing threat to international peace and growing political divisions, ideological divisions, still religious divisions, and all other, and humanitarian crisis related to migrations worldwide, and all these processes challenge the human morality and the unity in our understanding of common values, shared values. That's one challenge. Mm-hmm. And another challenge, at least for last few years, we see an unprecedented progress in developing of artificial intelligence, and there are some talks, at least some concerns about that it can run out of control. And what would you say? How would it change our perspective about humanism? Because how would you treat it? Is it still human intelligence? Is it superhuman? Is it anti-human? And do you think that maybe we need a Humanist Manifesto 4 that would reflect maybe and respond on all these new challenges? Thank you.
Yeah,
every 40 years.
I would agree that there are a lot of things I didn't include because I have a limited amount of time to talk, and some things I'm not as up on, like artificial intelligence. I have to say, I understand. People are saying that it's going to be a real challenge to the way we live in our society and everything. In terms of regarding as human, I mean, to me it's a machine, ultimately, right? And no. And as long as it is contributing to human flourishing, then I don't see the problem with it. But if it is not contributing to human flourishing, like eliminating all the jobs, for example, and that sort of thing, then that would certainly be an issue. And yes, war, I mean, that's, of course, fighting and that sort of thing has been with us for a long time and is something that we as humans have to be concerned about. The climate change, as I understand it, is likely to make this worse as people fight over when droughts and this sort of thing, and fighting over water, they say is going to be a real big thing. So I agree with you. There's a lot more things that we have to be concerned about. And how do we need to choose which ones are more important? I don't know. I think we as individuals have to decide where we want to put our effort, and then maybe humanist organizations likewise have to decide where they want to put their effort. I have noted the American Humanist Association just came up with a program called Humanist Environmental Response Effort, or HERE, H-E-R-E. It's a very new program, but I think it's an effort to allow humanists, mobilize humanists to fight against the climate change problem.
These ideas have been evolving over 2,000 years.
Yep.
So how is it in the most advanced country on the planet, we have Adolf Trump getting 50% of the voting population? And could this be a genetic problem? And also, how many humanists do you think there actually are?
Oh, it's good questions. In terms of why we have a regressive political situation from a humanist viewpoint right now, it's an interesting question. We did look at the role of religion, and we know that one of the core constituency that Trump has is a religious right, and even though his personal behavior is certainly, I would imagine most people in that category would think is pretty disgusting. I would hope anyway, but he he appeals to for abortion, for example. I mean, they're willing to put up with anything because they're opposed to abortion, and they know that he's going to appoint judges who will not uphold abortion. So that's part of it too. Yeah, and are we moving to be more secular, and how many of us are? That's a very hard question to answer, but as we indicated, like 25% are not affiliated with any religion now. That some of those are atheists, some are humanists, and some are just people who don't care, just apathists, I think they call them. But the number, I think, is increasing. If you look at the younger generation, you have even higher numbers. So it suggests that this process will continue. But, history reverses itself a lot, so we can't be sure it's going to continue to do that.
How many humans? 2,500?
Well, I don't know. The American Humanist Association, which would not be all humanists by any means, they I don't know, what, 3,000, 10,000, something like that. But that's not all humanists, though.
FFRF is 40,000.
40,000, okay.
Hi, is humanism a Western concept only? And in China, for example, the concept of God didn't exist. There were Taoism and Confucianism. So can you discuss or comment on how the rest of the world, not just the Western world, addresses humanism?
Right.
And also racial diversity. Racism is a pretty rampant. There was incident recently as well. How the humanist group address that?
Okay, good questions. Regarding is humanism only a Western phenomena, I think the answer is no. I did have a slide to kind of cover that, but limited time. There were certainly in Asia, there were groups called the Karvaka in India who were atheists, basically. And there are, I think, groups in Asia who are certainly humanistic. I think it's an interesting question. Is Buddhism a form of humanism? In some sense it is. The Buddha did not rely on revelation. He did not rely on reading the Bible. He kind of figured out it himself. Now, there are certain aspects of that culture. I think that probably reincarnation and the idea of karma are probably essential to Buddhism. I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but in terms of being naturalistic, in terms of not receiving a revelation and trying to develop things which will bring about human flourishing, definitely I would say that would be a form of humanism. And maybe Taoism, I just don't know enough about Taoism. Confucianism, I don't think it's a religion, and so that could also be a form of Asian humanism. In terms of diversity, I think it's been a problem in the humanist community, not having a good representation of people from all backgrounds. I think the American Humanist Association is doing a lot to try to change that. If you go to their conferences, they always have programs that address that issue, and I believe they have caucuses of people of color who want to increase their visibility in the organization. So I think that given the changing demographics of this country, any organization that wants to thrive in the future needs to do that. And I think it is happening, but a lot of work to be done, I guess.
Well, someone said, how did we get to this place? And I think one of our major problems was that we never controlled Fox News. We let them lie, and they persuaded half the country that a lot of stuff is not true. And that should have been nipped in the bud. We have a federal communications something. I really blame Fox News for a lot. And I know that there are people behind that too, but we never should have let this happen.
Yeah, the whole Fox News is not it's one of the major perpetrators of this, and the whole thing of misinformation on the internet and that sort of thing, and how do you deal with that? I think it's a really tough thing. You got freedom of speech on the one hand, and you got people's right to know what's true on the other, and to be able to label things which aren't true. That. I think it's a tough problem. I don't know. With the Russian involvement, I don't know if. I hope something's being done for the next election, because I fear to think what might happen if it's not, and it's not clear to me that things are happening to prevent that. I guess we'll see.
Yes, I have a question about how the humanists are, what they're doing about overpopulation, and I think that's a main underlying problem with climate change, and I'm already seeing. To me, I see all these populations being displaced and refugees fleeing, and here and in Europe, countries kind of backing up away from, welcoming people and trying to keep them out, and the general trend in that direction. And so I really think that the effects of climate change are already well upon us. And I'm wondering what the Humanist manifesto has to say about overpopulation.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Humanist Manifesto 3. Manifesto 2 was actually more detailed, so it might be there, but I haven't checked it recently. But just in terms of the problem itself, I think climate change is two problems. One, those of us in wealthy countries pollute too much, and then there is worldwide population growth. And in some of those countries, people are living better lives. Like China has developed a middle class, and it's huge, because of their huge population. But I think the way to deal with the population, we sort of know how to deal with it, I think. What happens once medicine and healthcare and that sort of thing is available to a country, vaccines and so forth, the population goes up a lot because people aren't dying as much. And that's a good thing. We don't want people dying of diseases and hunger and that sort of thing. What happens eventually if the country becomes prosperous enough, and if women have autonomy, so they can, go out and get jobs if they want to, and control their reproduction, then the population evens out, and in some countries even goes down. So I see the best way to fight the population thing is to empower women, and that will take it a long way.
So, taking on a little bit of the artificial intelligence that people were talking about, a real biological intelligence, in addition to establishing connections, it also does a fair amount of pruning, deciding that certain connections are either not useful or harmful. Mm-hmm. And in addition to which, it doesn't kind of have an ulterior motive of marketing, which is basically a form of propaganda. So I think when people talk about artificial intelligence not being like human intelligence, a fair amount of it comes from the fact that it isn't designed like human intelligence, and it has an ulterior motive, which actually is not pro-reason. So maybe that should filter into what the humanists decide to think about.
How to control that so it doesn't get out of control. Yeah, and I that's not an area I know a lot about, so not a lot I can add to that.
Anybody have any other questions?
I guess I have one more. With regard to the subject of artificial intelligence, I can't understand why our species would want to hand over its control over its own life, which we apparently have finally got some control over, to a machine. It doesn't make sense to me. It just seems totally wacky.
Yeah. It sounds dangerous to me if you want to do that. Yeah.
Well, maybe logical isn't everything.
I wanted to say that I think from an ethical standpoint, most of the world is humanistic. If you ask people what's good and what's bad, they don't rely on a book, they don't rely on authority. They use their own judgment. I think the Beatles said it well with "All You Need Is Love."
Yeah, I think a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of I guess I disagree with you a little bit. There's certainly a lot of people who claim to be religious, particularly on the liberal end of things. And if you ask them, what do they believe about abortion or gay rights or any of these issues that we deal with, they choose and select the verses in the Bible and ignore others. I've often wondered how do you know which verses to choose and which ones to reject? So I think you're right in that for these people, they have humanist values, so they're really being influenced by humanist values and humanist thinking. But then you have the other folks who do go to the Bible and they do find that thing, you stone people and burn people, and they take that seriously.
Has it always been in history that people were frightened about people that look different and were different from them? Because it seems like now, I don't know if it's worse now, but it seems worse now that we're more afraid of people who are different looking or different values. But what about over a period of humanity? Has it always been the same? The people were frightened of people that were different?
Well, I think there's always been an element of that, but certainly if you go back, our hunter-gatherers, everyone they saw probably looked like they did because people didn't mingle from far distances. But then you had these big empires which would go out and conquer everyone and actually bring a lot of people together. And some people say that was one reason that religion came up, to allow these people who maybe their natural biological instinct was to not trust people who didn't look like them. But if you thought the other person believed in the same God you did, then maybe you would trust them more. I don't know if that theory is correct, but that's certainly a theory you hear. But certainly it is, as we become more accustomed to being with people of look different or speak differently or whatever, I think that diminishes. It's not something that has to be with us. We can certainly overcome that.
Okay, this is going to be the last question, and then we're going to have an announcement.
Yes, I have an interest in macroeconomics, and I have a big question, is that how wealth is created and who should be rewarded and who shouldn't. And those of us who remember the years of Ma Bell, where we had a monopoly, nothing was invented, you paid what they told you to pay. Mm-hmm. So obviously that's bad. But what about here in Silicon Valley? The 3 richest men in the world who created benefits for all of us, we have an option. Is there really something wrong with having too much wealth, like these 3 men do? I'd appreciate your suggestions.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with having too much wealth. I think it's wrong to have too much wealth concentrated in too few hands, so maybe 3 is too few. Because if the consequence of that is if fewer and fewer people have what they need to flourish and have a good life, then there is a problem with that. There's an interesting graph that I didn't show it, but it shows the increasing productivity over time along with increasing wages, and for a long time those are right on top of each other, as they should be. As the working classes, they contribute to productivity, they should be rewarded. Then I think maybe the 80s or 70s, or I can't remember what year, it just changes. The productivity continues up and wages flatten off. Not really sure why that happens. There's a lot of potential explanation. A lot of potential explanations. So that's how I would look at that. That if you have wealth too concentrated, then the people who are on the bottom are not going to be happy, and it will lead to instabilities.
So you have some very quick.
My theory is that the reason it happened at that time was the weakening of unions. So you have no counterbalancing force.
Yeah, good point.
I have an announcement, but before that, let's express our appreciation to Jim.
Thank you.